For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, the rock of your refuge. You have not remembered. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh. And today we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 17. This is part of the ongoing section here of the oracles about the nations. And this oracle is going to talk about Judah's neighbors to the north, particularly Syria, and to some degree, the nation of Israel. This is part of my ongoing series on the book of Isaiah. If you'd like to start it from the beginning, I have a whole playlist that begins at the beginning and takes you all the way through to, well, apparently chapter 17 so far. We start off here in verse 1 with saying, an oracle concerning Damascus. This is a Massa, something that we've talked about several times now. This is a thing that is carried, a burden that is lifted. And this is the one concerning Damascus. Now, Damascus, of course, is the capital city of Syria, also known as Aram. It is not to be confused with Assyria, which is a whole different nation that's over in Mesopotamia. This is a nation which is roughly in the same spot as where modern-day Syria is, to the north of where the modern-day nation of Israel is. And Damascus, their capital city here, is who this oracle is addressed to. And you will have Damascus and Syria swapped out somewhat interchangeably. They both just reference that nation. And we start off here with the beginning lines of the prophecy saying, behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become ruins. Well, you'll see some translations that add another word in there, will become a heap of ruins. We're not quite sure what the word means. This comes from the word ma'i, which is otherwise unknown and is generally believed to just be a scribal error, since it looks a lot like the word for city, which is right next to it, a word or two back, except that it's missing the final letter resh or r. The Septuagint does not have this extra word in it, and so that kind of strengthens our idea that maybe this is a scribal accident, that perhaps a scribe accidentally copied the same word twice. We call this a didograph. So many translations drop that word out. Translations that want to keep it represented try to come up with what would go with ruins, and a heap or a pile seems to be a common thing here. So will become a heap of ruins, but most likely that word is a scribal error. And that's a thing that we're going to talk about quite a bit in this chapter. There are a number of places where the text is difficult, and we think it may involve scribal errors, including our next line. Our next line here is, the cities of Aroer are deserted. Obviously, this goes with the idea that Damascus is ceasing to be a city and is going to become ruins, but also the cities of Aroer. So where is Aroer? Well, we don't know. There are at least two towns we know of. One of them is in Moab, which we discussed recently, and the other one is in Judah. And they are both named Aroer. But we don't know of a town like that in Syria. Now, cities do disappear from history, but we're just stuck here with not really knowing where this location is at. And it would seem that it would have to be in Syria somewhere based on the beginning of this prophecy. The city of Aroer, the Moabite version of it, is actually mentioned in the Mesha Stela, which we have talked about in the past on this channel. And so there's the city of Aroer and Moab, which is near the Arnon, which is that big river valley there that is in Moab. There is also an Aroer in Judah, which is mentioned at one point. There is also an Aroer in the territory of Ammon. There are a couple of places where we have cities with this name, but the name itself, Aroer, seems to mean juniper bushes. And so that's not a terribly unusual thing. We would expect a name like that to be somewhat common, and the idea that multiple cities could have this name is certainly possible. But we also wonder if maybe that's not what's really happening here. The fact is, the name Aroer looks a lot like the word for city as well. And one of the ways people try to correct this verse, to amend it, is to change this around to, her cities are permanently abandoned. So rather than the cities of Aroer are abandoned, that her cities are permanently. abandoned. And there's some support for this with the Targum that has something like this in there. That involves replacing 3 letters with look-alike letters in Hebrew. That's possible, but it's a bit of a big emendation, and having only the Targum supporting that reading, that's not a whole lot of textual evidence to support it. But again, cities disappear, and sometimes we have no record of them. But while it may be impossible from our perspective now to say exactly what this line was intending to convey, our options are kind of limited. Either it is referencing a now forgotten city, or it's just paralleling the previous line that cities in general will be destroyed. But the sentiment overall seems to be the same. Damascus and the nation of Syria, which it represents as its capital, is going to be destroyed. They're going to be left in an abandoned state. And so the burden for Damascus here is that they won't be lasting very long. Well, moving on in our section here, it says, they will be for flocks which lie down, and none will make them afraid. This is a bit of a recurring theme that we see in Isaiah, that after a once thriving city is destroyed, it is taken over by agrarian people who graze flocks in the once busy streets. And so this is a theme here, that your city is a bunch of ruins and now shepherds pasture their flocks there. We continue here, the fortress will disappear from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel. Now we bring in the nation of Israel, which was the nation to the north of Judah. The United Kingdom had divided into 2 pieces. Judah was the southern kingdom, Israel was the northern kingdom. And if you remember some of our earlier chapters in Isaiah, the northern kingdom of Israel was in an alliance with Syria and came marching up to the gates of Jerusalem in Isaiah's early career. So this is coming back to this alliance between the two, that their fates seem to be intertwined, which brings us to a lot of questions as to when was this prophecy written? We're not sure. One of the big questions is, was it written before Israel was destroyed? Because Isaiah will see that happen in 722 BCE. Was it written before Damascus and Syria was destroyed? Hard to say. But here we have this bit of a chiasm where the outer lines reference Israel by both its name Israel and also its name Ephraim, Ephraim being the primary tribe in the northern kingdom, and the inner lines referencing Syria by both Damascus and Syria. And it's saying that the fortress and the kingdom are going to disappear from these places, and that what's left over from them is going to be tied together, perhaps, with the children of Israel. It feels a little like there might be a word missing from this verse, but the general idea here is that Syria seems to be suffering the same fate as the kingdom of Israel. But the problem is, Syria was destroyed about 10 years before Israel. It would seem more natural if this were reversed, saying that Israel will be like Syria. But that may be a hint here that maybe this was written before either of them were destroyed, and the order that it's going to happen in isn't that important. But if Israel had already been destroyed, and saying that the remnant of Syria is going to wind up like the children of Israel were, where that doesn't make a ton of sense, because Syria is destroyed 10 years before Israel is destroyed. And so, yeah, it seems like that should be reversed there, unless all of this was maybe written before either of them were destroyed. In which case, this is simply future looking and saying that they're going to wind up much the same. And then it ends with our very common phrase here, declares the Lord of hosts. And this, of course, is the Lord's military title, the Lord of armies, and is frequently used in pronouncements like this. So their cities are going to be destroyed, and the fortress and the kingdom are going to be taken away. So their military power, their ability, the fortress is the idea of a walled city, a well-defended city. So their defenses, their political might is all going to be destroyed. And what's left of Syria is going to be like the glory of the children of Israel, which it's going to explain to us is something that is also in danger. And then with verse 4 here, we go a little bit more on that glory of the children of Israel as we talk about them under the name Jacob. It says, in that day will be brought low the glory of Jacob, and the fat of his flesh will grow lean. The word here for grow lean's a little bit uncertain as well, but from context and a few other possible appearances of the word, lean seems to be a reasonable translation of it. It's interesting, though, because the word for glory has also the sense of weightiness or heaviness. And so it seems to be playing on this meaning here that it talks about Jacob's flesh growing lean, that he's going to lose all of his weight, all of his gravitas. And so the glory here is sort of the opposite of leanness. Jacob is going to lose that and waste away. And this is going to be the same fate that's tied up with Syria. And it goes further here. It shall be as when the reaper gathers standing grain and his arm harvests the ears, as when one gleans the ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. So there's a couple of interesting words in this section here. Let's start with the word for ears. The word here that's translated as ears is the famous word shibboleth. If you remember, a lot of Ephraimites lost their life over not being able to pronounce it correctly. This is what the word that means, an ear of grain. But remember, these are not ears like we think of in America as ears of corn. Corn or maize is indigenous to the New World, and there was no such thing in the ancient world. Instead, ears is just an older, old-fashioned way of saying heads of grains. These are like heads of wheat or heads of barley that they grew there. Although some older translations will still even say ears of corn in this verse, it's not talking about corn like we think of in America as maize. This is old world grain, and these are not big yellow vegetables. The other phrase here, the valley of Rephaim. Rephaim, you may recognize the word. We talked about this just a few chapters back in Isaiah 14. The Rephaim are the spirits of the dead, also possibly giants. The word itself means healers. And they're saying here, the valley of Rephaim, the valley of the shades, the valley of the ghosts. And that may have something to do here with what we're talking about. This is going to be like when one gleans ears of grain in the valley of the ghosts, which maybe that was an actual place with that name. If it is, we don't know about it. But maybe it also is some sort of a reference to Sheol, to the underworld, that this is a place they understood as being in the realm of the dead, that it was a futile thing to sow and harvest grain there. That may be what this is saying here. But the idea here is that there's not going to be a lot, that Jacob's glory is going to be growing lean, and that the harvest, well, normally the thing that is the lifeblood of an agrarian society, is going to be like when you are harvesting in the valley of ghosts. And so I think even though we may not know if this is a literal earthly place they're referring to or a legendary mythic place in the underworld, the meaning still seems quite clear that this is not going to be a good harvest. And so it continues on here in verse 6, gleanings will be left in it. Now, gleanings is the idea that's mentioned in the law of Moses, that you weren't to take all the crops you could absolutely harvest, but you were to leave certain parts of the crop behind, and then the poor would come into the fields and glean and get the last bit that you left behind. You were supposed to purposely make sure you left enough behind that the poor people could come in and get something to eat. This is famously in the book of Ruth, but it's saying that there are going to be gleanings left, that not everybody is going to be destroyed. And then it describes it here as when an olive tree is beaten, 2 or 3 ripe olives in the top of the highest bough, 4 or 5 on the branches of a fruit tree. And then it ends it with the same formula here, declares the Lord God of Israel. There's a few things about this that are really interesting. This image of gleaning olives, it's going to come back in Isaiah chapter 24. And this word here for beating an olive tree, which is noketh, occurs only in these 2 chapters of Isaiah and nowhere else. So this is a unique Isaiah image here, that you have an olive tree that has been mostly harvested, but there's a couple of ripe olives, 2 or 3, 4 or 5, and this is a typical type of Hebrew poetry here where you intensify in the succeeding lines. I actually talked with somebody on the Discord server about this recently, that you start off with 2 or 3, then you intensify it to 4 or 5. But the idea is overall just a few. There's just a few olives left, and you get them by beating the tree and trying to knock them down. You have to get to the various branches. Now, this word here for ripe olives is this interesting word garger, and it only occurs here. Although we have found similar words in Arabic and Akkadian, so we're pretty sure of its meaning, but the only time it shows up in the Hebrew Bible is in this verse here, that there's going to be 2 or 3 of these garger left on the tree. The word that is translated as bough here only occurs here, and then again in verse 9, where we actually question what its meaning is. It's similar in spelling to the word for Amorites, and we're going to talk about that a little in verse 9, but it doesn't show up anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible either, other than these 2 places. And the fact that it shows up twice in one chapter and nowhere else is kind of interesting. But we also wonder, is it a play on words, or is it maybe a scribal error? But likewise, the other word here that we translate as branches is also a fairly obscure word that is used here and again over in Isaiah chapter 27. And the way it's written in the original traditional text doesn't make a lot of sense. The traditional text here reads, "On her branches, her fruit." That's really strange that we're wording it that way. That's not normal. But the Dead Sea Scrolls actually reads closer to what our translation here is, "On the branches of her fruit." So it drops the "her branches" and changes it to "branches of," which makes a little bit more sense. So I think the Dead Sea Scrolls is the more correct reading here, and the traditional text has introduced some scribal errors. But overall, the sense here is that Syria, or possibly the northern kingdom of Israel, they're going to be tied together in their fate, and there's not going to be much left out of them. There's just going to be a few gleanings that will have to really be gathered through some effort, because they're going to be on the branches you can barely reach, and there's only going to be a few of them. And we have this interesting repeated phrase here, "declares the Lord." It's in both verse 3 and verse 6. It makes us wonder if maybe these were separate prophecies that have been kind of grouped thematically. Maybe they weren't given at the same time, but as somebody was compiling this book of the sayings of Isaiah, that they thought these 2 should go together. That's a possibility. It is interesting that one of them is "declares the Lord of hosts," and the other one is "declares the Lord God of Israel." And the one talking about remnants being left behind, he uses his title "God of Israel," whereas the one that he was talking about, there's the cities being destroyed, he uses his military title "Lord of Hosts." Now, at this point, we have an interesting, even remarkable turnaround as we describe the repentance of the people, maybe the people of Syria, maybe the people of Israel, maybe they're joined together and this is both of them. But it says here in verse 7, "In that day, a man will look to his maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel." So now we have this idea that because of the destruction, because there's not much left of them, they're going to suddenly turn to the Holy One of Israel. Now, what's interesting here is there are 2 different words for "look" in these 2 lines. And there's not really I guess you could translate one of them as "gaze" or something like that. But then those same 2 words for "look" are repeated in the next verse, where it says, "He will not look to the altars, the work of his hands. He will not look on what his own fingers have made, the Asherim and the altars of incense." So we are going to turn from paganism and the religion that they were practicing, and this seems mostly directed at Syria, but we know that the nation of Israel was also having trouble with the same type of pagan influences. They're going to turn from that paganism and turn to the Holy One of Israel. So we have a complete repentance here of the remnant that are left. And this is a bit of a recurring theme in these oracles, where we talk about other nations turning to God. And it also comes back to our understanding of these passages. Are they intended to narrate historical fact, things that Isaiah in his lifetime observed or would observe, or are they speaking in symbolic and mythological terms, and that perhaps this is speaking of a general pattern? But these 2 nations that had allied themselves together in defiance and war against Judah, that they are going to be mostly destroyed, and the remnants that are left are going to turn around and repent. Then we have verse 9, which is a tough verse. And this is one of the things that's always difficult about translations, is translations tend to hide the difficulties in translation, because when you wind up with the English text, it's often very smooth and readable, regardless of what the Hebrew underneath it was like. And so it tends to mask problems in the text. But 9 is a complicated verse to try to figure out what it's saying. It says, in that day, his cities of refuge will be like the deserted places. Okay. The forests and the branch which they deserted. Getting a little bit more interesting there. Before the children of Israel, and it will be desolation. We got the general sense here that this is going to be bad. We're back to the idea that the cities are going to be deserted. But what does the forests and the branch which they deserted mean? And why did they desert them before the children of Israel? Well, the problem is there are words in this that we just don't know what they mean. And this word for branch here is the same word that we had a few verses earlier for branch, which is ha'amir. And so here we have this phrase, hachoresh v'ha'amir, the forests and the branch. We think that it might be correct to amend it to choreshe ha'amori, which is the woods of the Amorites. So if we do that, now the verse reads, in that day his cities of refuge will be like deserted places, the woods of the Amorites, which they abandoned before the children of Israel, and it will be a desolation. So now we have a verse that makes a lot more sense if we change that to mean Amorites and say that this is the woods or forests of the Amorites that are going to be deserted. The Amorites, of course, were a people that were driven out by the Israelites when they came in. And so just as they were driven out and scattered from the land, so now Syria and Israel will be driven out and scattered from the land. That emendation basically drops one letter, then adds another and transposes two letters. It may seem overly creative, but actually the Septuagint agrees with this and actually goes further. And instead of saying the forests of the Amorites, they change that word to the Hivites. And so the Septuagint says, in that day thy cities shall be deserted as the Amorites and the Hivites deserted theirs because of the children of Israel, and they shall be desolate. So the Septuagint understood this to be referencing the previous peoples of the land, that they're going to be deserted like the previous peoples of the land had to desert the land, that same fate is going to happen to Israel and Syria. It's hard to say what the correct text should be, but that does make a lot more sense than what it currently reads, where the forest and the branch which they deserted, although that may be using symbolic language to mean something, it seems like referring to what the Amorites and the Hivites deserted is a little bit more solid and grounded in what we know happened. We have, for you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and the rock of your refuge have not remembered. So this seems to be a reversal of verse 7, which said they will look to their maker and to the Holy One of Israel. Here it's saying that they have forgotten the God of their salvation and the rock of refuge. This is an interesting thing to say about Syria, because as far as we know, Syria never worshipped the God of Israel. And so it'd be strange to say that they have forgotten him. So perhaps this is directed more explicitly at the children of Israel rather than to Syria, but it's difficult to say. And if you look back into the history of the patriarchs, there is a lot of indication that Abraham came from Syria, that was his background there. And so they may be referencing that when they say that you have forgotten the God of your salvation. The word here for rock, it is a common epithet for God and is used very frequently in the Psalms, but it also has a sense of hardness to it that forms a nice antithesis to the plants that we're about to talk about in the next verse. The phrase here, though, rock of your refuge, the word here translated as refuge, is the same word that we used in conjunction with cities that were going to be abandoned back in verse 9. So there does seem to be some continuation of that thought and some play on words here, that they're going to abandon their cities of refuge because they have forgotten the rock of their refuge. But then we have the second half of verse 10 here, which is quite a mystery. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants, which is some nice alliteration in English, and sow the vine branch of a stranger. Well, in Hebrew, this is a cognate accusative where both your verb and your direct object come from the same root, which they love to do in Hebrew. The actual Hebrew word order is though you plant plants pleasant. And so planting plants here is this example of a cognate accusative. Now, you plant these pleasant plants. Oddly, the word for pleasant is plural, and the word is naaman, which generally means pleasant or nice. But that also was the name of a deity. And so we think this might be Tammuz, who is a god that dies annually and is reborn each spring. Joseph Blenkinsop, great Isaiah scholar, he went even further and said that it is the equivalent of the Greek god Adonis. The word here, though, Naamanim, which is this plural word, there is a god, Naaman, that is worshipped in Syria and Phoenician cities. And we think that is the same god as the god that is Tammuz, that's mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14, and that might be influenced by the Greek concept of Adonis. But what is generally agreed here is that this is describing some type of cultically significant plant and not just saying that it was a nice plant. The plural is odd, and we're not sure why it would be plural. One thought is that it might refer to a class of gods rather than a specific god. So the pleasure gods, perhaps. Therefore, you plant plants of the pleasure gods, and so the vine branch of a stranger. The idea that we're saying it's of a stranger here talks about these are foreign customs that have been imported. And so there's some sort of an agrarian practice here that has cultic significance and is probably related to gods that were worshipped in Syria that perhaps have been adopted by the children of Israel. But this second half of verse 10 here clearly belongs with what happens in verse 11 rather than what was discussed in verse 10. So really we have kind of an odd division of verses here that this really should belong to the next verse. But if we look at verse 11, what it says, in the day of your planting, she cultivates, and in the morning of your sowing, she blossoms. A stand harvest in a day of grief and incurable pain. Well, there's a lot to that we don't quite get either. The idea here that in the day of your planting, she cultivates, it's a kind of a cool word here, which Isaiah loves, where he has this repeated syllable, to sagsagi. It only occurs here. We have tried to relate it to other roots to try and understand what the meaning is. Some of the roots that kind of make sense are to cultivate. Another root is to be fenced in. Something to do with plants. The day of your planting, she is fenced in. She cultivates. None of those make a great deal of sense. But we're saying something about the day that they plant it, she, probably meaning the plant, does something. In the morning, parallel to in the day, so also when you plant it, she blossoms. So the idea here is that they put the plant in and it does something and produces flowers. Okay, simple enough. We're saying that they planted their plants to this vegetable god, and this is part of a foreign influence that they brought in. In the day they plant it, it grows and flowers. And then we have this couplet at the end here, which the best translation we can give is a stand harvest in the day of grief and incurable pain. Robert Alter, one of the translators I like, points out that of the 4 Hebrew words of this verse set, the only one whose meaning is certain is bayom, which means in the day. So yes, we don't know what the rest of these words mean. This word here for a stand harvest or a heap harvest, hard to say what that's trying to say. Maybe it relates back to harvesting in the valley of Rephaim, but then it's going to be in a day of grief and incurable pain, which doesn't sound very pleasant if we have the right meanings for those words, which are questionable. So there is a lot of question around what verse 11 is intended to say. I doubt it says anything positive about planting this cultic garden. So I think we can probably guess that this is intended to be a negative consequence to them doing that. But the Hebrew is far from clear here, and you're probably going to see a lot of variance as you move from translation to translation on this. Coming to verse 12, we now seem to have a shift to something entirely different. We move away from Syria and Israel, and now we focus on their destroyers. So while we've talked about them being destroyed, we've talked about them returning to the Lord, and we talked about how they had forgotten the Lord and that they went after these vegetable gods. We now here come to verse 12. The thunder of many peoples, like the thundering of the sea, they thunder. Yes, a lot of thundering in that verse. And then parallel to it here, and the roar of nations, like the roaring of mighty waters, they roar. And then we have an extra line added on here, nations, like the roaring of many waters, they roar. Some have said this is a very repetitive couple of lines here, and that maybe it doesn't really reflect the typical style of Isaiah, particularly that first part of verse 13 seems really questionable that should be there, because it's almost a verbatim repetition, although it seems to combine a few elements from both of the lines in verse 12. It seems that maybe something has happened here that it got put in place there, but we don't know of any historical event that this refers to. These nations would be destroyed by the nation of Assyria, and Assyria would not have bad happen to it for quite a long time after these nations were destroyed. This final line here, nations like the roaring of many waters they roar, that's actually missing from several of the early medieval manuscripts and also from the Syriac. And so there's some evidence there that may have been added erroneously, and that only the two lines should really be there. But it is this image here that these people are going to be thundering and roaring. So we have the idea of a very loud and powerful invading people coming in that will destroy them. But then in the second part of verse 13, it changes the tides on them. But he will rebuke them, and he will flee far away, chased like chaff of the mountains before the wind, and like a tumbleweed before the storm. So the idea here that he's going to rebuke him being the invading army, and he will flee far away, probably meaning the invading army will flee far away. Pronouns, they often didn't explain the antecedents. You're just supposed to figure it out. Well, they're going to be blown away like chaff on the mountains before the wind. And then we have the lovely word here, tumbleweed. The actual Hebrew word means a rolling thing, which actually is exactly how King James translated it, a rolling thing. But tumbleweed seems to be a good approximation, because that's how tumbleweeds work. It's parallel with chaff, so it's obviously some kind of a rolling plant that is caught in the wind. Tumbleweed. The other suggestions that have come up for it, though, is that it might be a reference to maybe a dust devil or something like that it is a spinning bit of wind. But I think tumbleweed sounds more likely and is a stronger parallel with chaff. So that makes sense. So these armies that are coming in, though they are mighty and roar like many waters, they will be rebuked, and they will have to leave, and will be as powerless as chaff in the wind or a tumbleweed before a mighty storm. And so the idea is that this is what happens when a mighty power comes up against God's people. And we finish it off with verse 14, kind of concreting that idea here. At eventime, and behold terror. Before morning, they are no more. So we have here, in the evening time, you're in terror. But before the morning comes, this army is gone. Now, the word here for terror is kind of an interesting one. It also appears in Job, and there it seems to reference the king of terror, who is a particular being of the underworld. And so, yeah, this may be the idea of rebuking some type of a mythological creature who is coming at them with this great roaring power, that God simply rebukes him, and he is driven away like chaff or a tumbleweed, and that's all the power he has. And we end it with a couplet here. This is the portion of those who loot us, and the lot of those who plunder us. The word loot here is an interesting one. It appears to be a loan word from Egyptian. But yes, this is saying that this is what happens to those who destroy the Lord's people. And interestingly, it seems that Syria and Israel are both lumped into this. And I mean, we opened this whole prophecy referencing Syria, not Israel. And while Israel's been mentioned, they have been a major part of this prophecy. So this seems to be that the Lord is extending this blessing, or this inheritance, to both Israel and Syria, and that this is what happens to people who go up against the Lord's people. And that's it. And that's chapter 17 here of Isaiah. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any comments, please leave them below. Give me a like and a subscribe. Really helps out the channel. And I'll see you in the next one.